our PowerPoint, on the top right-hand corner, you're able to download our PowerPoint presentation at any time during the webinar. And right below that is our links pod, and where you'll see our evaluation. We'd greatly appreciate it if you could take a few minutes just to complete this after the webinar. It really helps us ensure that we're providing high quality training and technical assistance. Please remember to email me immediately after the webinar, immediately after you've done the evaluation, to request your CRC credits. And right below that, on the bottom right-hand corner, feel free to participate in conversation with everyone else and place your questions right here for our speakers, Kim and Wendy. Okay, so that's it. I'm going to be handing it over to Kim.
Jessica, this is Wendy Quarles, one of the speakers. Can you hear me? Oh, okay. I did want to mention that we have a slide that features, you'll see this in our webinar instructions about, let me get to it, please. Apologize. There's a slide in your handout that talks about whether the webinar is being recorded or not. We will be making a decision about whether we post the recording post-webinar because of the nuance of the requirements for tracking attendance on an ethics workshop. So we'll be in touch about that, so that if you're one of the folks that know other folks that are looking to achieve ethics credits by listening in on this webinar, we'll be in touch about our process for doing that. So thank you. Didn't mean to interrupt. Kim, would you like to take it away?
Sure. Thank you for remembering that and for putting the slide back to where they mentioned the recording. So as Jessica mentioned, we are excited to have everybody here today. We have over 500, well, we have 500 people registered for this event. So we're excited to continue to see those who've logged in continue to grow. Right now we're at about 151, so that's great. And that includes us. Just a little bit about myself, and then I'll turn it over to Wendy. I am, like Wendy, we're employees of Cornell University, and my role, I split my time between two projects. One is the Voc Rehab Youth Technical Assistance Center that we're representing today, and another is on a Office of Disability Employment Policy project. And with YTAC, I serve as a technical assistance liaison, specifically working with state Voc Rehab agencies and their partners to help ensure that youth and students with disabilities from what we call opportunity youth populations have access to and get engaged with VR services. So in a little bit here, we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. But my background, I began as a special education teacher. I moved from Florida to Oklahoma 24 and a half years ago. Taught special education at the elementary, middle school, and high school level for 10 years before I... Oh gosh, sorry, hang on.
I will take over. Is addressing her dog. Kim, if you want to go to mute. So sorry, we both work remotely, and so sometimes we have the unique challenges of having our pets visit us, and maybe you can hear me having fire trucks go by. So I'm Wendy Quarles, and we'll let Kim finish her introduction in a minute. But I'm Wendy Quarles, one of the co-presenters on this webinar today. I also work at Cornell University. I have the title of Project Director at the university, and I work on a number of projects. One is our brand new Youth Policy Center, so we'll be taking a look at all sorts of national and federal policies that states are adhering to as it relates to serving and supporting youth. I work on the VR YTAC, which is sponsoring this webinar today, and I also run a statewide supported employment training and technical assistance project in New York State. So I happen to live in Rochester, New York. I've been at this for 34 years. Sometimes when when you're planning to talk about yourself and you do the math, you realize, wow, as we hit 2020, I've been doing this for 34 years. Of the last 20, paying attention to training and technical assistance. I have a unique background also as being a supported employer. So I've worked for the YMCA for 39 of my grown-up years, and in that position have hired persons with disabilities and worked with agencies making placements. So I have a unique perspective on the field in which we work, both as a practitioner, a supervisor, a teacher, and also an employer. So Kim, I'll toss it back to you. I hope your dog is happier. And you're on mute, Kim?
Hello, can you hear me now?
We can.
Okay, I was unmuted, but it wasn't showing unmuted on the screen. Talking in my back, that was strange. So as I was saying, taught special education for 10 years before I went to the State Department of Education. And I really got into transition my last couple of years of teaching at the middle school level, where I was introduced to self-directed IEPs and really working with my students to gain their own voice. And it continued to grow from there, continuing to my job at the State Department of Ed, where that became one of the many hats that I wore, and it became a passion of mine, and was able to take that passion and experience over to the Voc Rehab Agency here in Oklahoma, where I got to spend 9 years as the statewide transition coordinator, working with multiple partners across the state, really enjoying that and continuing to deepen my knowledge and passion in transition. So that's a little bit about us. We're excited again to have you all here. Thank you for Wendy for stepping in my moment of, So as Jessica mentioned, and for those of you who may have gotten on just a few minutes late, we do have an evaluation that we will ask you to complete at the conclusion of this webinar. And if you are going to be seeking CRC credits from us, it's a necessity that you do complete the evaluation, and you will email Jessica Fuentes-Diaz requesting the CRC, and there will be another slide with that information at the end of the webinar. So please pay attention to the screen. We'll have a link on there for you where you can click and complete the evaluation right at the closing of the webinar. And here's the slide that talks about the CRC form that you can request after the webinar and you've completed the evaluation. You'll email Jessica. Her email is fuentesdiazj@iel.org. So fuentesdiazj@iel.org. And you can request the CRCC or CRC verification form at the conclusion of the webinar. So to jump into a little bit more about what is YTAC. And as Wendy and I both have stated, YTAC stands for the Vocational Rehabilitation Youth Technical Assistance Center. And we are one of several national centers that are funded by the federal government. Ours comes from the Rehabilitation Services Administration. And the grant is actually held by the Institute for Educational Leadership out of Washington, D.C. And out of IEL, they then have subcontracts with partners such as us from Cornell University, Boston University, and key subject matters from all over the United States who help with knowledge development and translation, developing webinars, policy briefs, and doing our evaluation. So it takes a lot of people to not only staff a center, but to make all the moving parts flow like a well-oiled machine. Us, like many of the TACs, are in our final year. We all conclude at the end of September 2020, and so we're looking to see what the next iteration of National Technical Assistance Centers will be. But a little bit about IEL, the Institute for Educational Leadership. It is based in Washington, D.C., and has been around for more than 50 years with a true focus on equity and leadership and really looking at the workforce and how to lift up, support, and empower people with disabilities and people from marginalized populations to really take leadership positions and thrive in their communities. Many of you might be familiar with the 411 on disability disclosure or the guideposts for success, and those are both products that came out of entities at IEL. And if you want to learn more about IEL, we put a link to the website. It's www.iel.org. A couple of our other partner centers that we do a lot of work with includes WINTAC, NTAC, and the National Collaborative, and I'll talk a little bit more about each one of those. So WINTAC is the Workforce Innovation Technical Assistance Center, and its wheelhouse, if you want to call it that, is everything to do with the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, WIOA, that includes the law that governs vocational rehabilitation. And they focus a lot on the pre-employment transition services for students with disabilities, supported employment, customized employment, and Section 511 of the law, which includes the sub-minimum wage language. Theirs is really a lot to do with policy and procedures and common performance measures, and they've got a wealth of information on their website. Another partner technical assistance center is NTACT, and that's the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition. They are also federally funded by the Office of Special Education Programs, but also some funds from the Rehab Services Administration to really build that connection between schools and vocational rehabilitation. They also have a slew of information on their website. They just recently held a summit bringing state teams together to talk about the Career and Technology Education Perkins 5 plan and how voc rehab and education and higher ed and career tech can all be collaborating and better supporting and serving our students and youth with disabilities. And lastly, I wanted to mention about the National Collaborative on Workforce and Disability for Youth that is housed at the Institute for Educational Leadership, and the resources that they have available. There's a ton of them on there. So we highly encourage you to visit each one of them and use them to help support your work. I mentioned earlier that WITAC serves to support state voc rehab agencies. And although there are other centers like WINTAC that is supporting them as well, our niche is really helping to focus on what we call opportunity youth populations. And we're looking at supporting and serving students and youth with disabilities who happen to be in other marginalized groups or other groups that may need a little bit more support and a different way of doing business than typical. So we're talking about possibly those with disabilities that might be in the foster care system or have or are experiencing homelessness, possibly even those who are in the juvenile justice system or who have been, including teen parents and pregnant teens, those individuals with disabilities that have aged out of school, are under the age of 25 but not engaged in further education, training, or employment, and also those who have dropped out. So we really have a diverse population that we work with, and we're supporting many states in those efforts to outreach and engage such youth. Wendy, is there anything you wanted to add on that?
Nope, I was muted. I apologize. No, thank you, Kim, for talking to us about what the WITAC brings to the table. We work in close partnership with the other technical assistance centers that Kim mentioned, and that gives us a very global perspective of what's going on in the field.
Thank you. So this brings us to the beginning of the webinar content today, that we're really going to be talking about things that impact all of us in our work, supporting youth in the voc rehab process and taking into account the ethics and culture and disability pieces that all come together and looking at a very holistic picture of serving youth. So without further ado, Wendy, I am going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kim. And I also want to take a moment to thank those people that are behind the scenes. Every webinar takes a whole team of people to pull it off. And so you heard us mention Jessica Fuentes Diaz, who's busily typing in and making sure that we're paying attention to all of the folks that are attending. We have 232 right now, as well as making sure that everybody has the technical capacity to listen in. So if you keep chatting, she's paying attention. I also want to thank our captioner Mary Kay. I'll do my best to keep my speed down and my voice up. You may hear I have a little bit of a crinkle in my voice, and Kim's positioned and ready to take over if I start to cough. And so if I want to just go back to the title again for a second, and why this topic, why would we pick this topic? Here we are the week before many of us are going out on the holidays, and it's a pretty important topic. And we have been in this conversation about these intersections. That word intersectionality gets used quite a bit these days, and Kim and I have found ourselves in this conversation multiple times. We had the opportunity to be accepted to speak on this topic at a National Supported Employment or Employment First conference in St. Louis this past summer. We were approved for an hour of conversation, and people told us that they would have spent all day with us if they had been given a chance. So it said to us, this is a pretty important topic that we want to begin to talk about. It also occurred to me with the passage of WIOA, the Workforce Innovations Opportunity Act, that because we are, many of us, serving a brand new population with the caseloads increasing, serving youth and young adults, that having this discussion, and if you are like my age in the 50s, you remember transparencies. I have that image of one transparency on top of another transparency on top of another transparency as we overlay ethical intersections. And so let me talk about our plan for the objectives today. So I will often use my 3 Ps as I consider objectives, because we said as a result of this webinar, participants will be able to. So, I always highlight that will be able to. What we hope that we're doing in this time frame of 1.5 hours, and maybe even a little less after the introductions, is that we are exposing you. So the purpose today is to begin the conversation. Our process is to create questions that cause conversations. So I'll repeat that. We love to create questions that cause conversations. So you may be saying, my gosh, I expected to get answers today, not questions today. but I love that approach of asking questions and teaching you to ask questions so that we can get to the bottom of what exactly are we facing in this field that's evolving every single day as we begin to and continue to serve this new population. And my 3rd P, so I did purpose, process, and my 3rd P for today is the payoff. The payoff that I'm hoping that you derive from this is that we've begun to talk about strategies, we've begun to talk about those things that we should be thinking of, and that you leave here saying, this isn't the last time that I want to have this conversation. So I will hit the objectives just a little bit at a time of applying our various codes of ethics and practice, exploring the ethical considerations and possible dilemmas when we are engaging youth and their families in the voc rehab process, negotiating the intersectionality of culture, family dynamics, and disability services. We'll give you a number of resources. You saw that we gave you a ton of downloadable material, some of my very, very favorite things, but we also have websites for you and information that you can look into. And that will do a little bit of dipping in on strategies. I'll say this ahead of time in case I run out of time at the end. If this stuff turns you on, get back in touch with us about methods and ways to infuse this conversation into the work you're doing. Do you want more training? Do you want conversation starters? Any of those pieces of information, ask away, and we're looking forward to hearing from you. So we, as a way of getting you involved, because I love teaching this class in person, and when I teach a webinar, I get to look at my computer screen wondering if the 233 of you, or plus, because you have groups in the room, are engaged in our conversation. So we're going to do a little bit of a test of engagement. And Jessica, if you could pull up the first question for us. So I'll read it out loud. How much of an influence are your professional ethics in your daily work life? And I ask you to be gut honest with us. And I'll give that just a couple minutes. Okay, I'll just give that another minute or so. Thank you, Jessica. So are you able to keep that up for a second while I talk about it? So that question was, how much of an influence are your professional ethics in your daily work life? And when I was talking about the fact of us pulling this class together, I asked this question because oftentimes after we have a concentrated opportunity to talk about ethics, people come up afterwards and say, thank goodness, I don't get to spend a lot of time in my daily work life talking about ethics, having these deeper conversations. And so I'm pleased to see that when we said how much of an influence are, very much of an influence, so 80% of you said it is influential, but we had a number of risk takers and truth tellers say, somewhat, very little, and just a little bit, because, and I'll talk in a few minutes. And Kim, do you have any insight on these numbers that you're seeing?
No, I would think that given the population of participants, that would be what I would expect to see, that it's definitely influencing their daily work.
Yep, and I have someone who typed into the chat box, Cheyenne, said huge influence, so thank you, and we'll be asking more questions about ethics. So if you can bring us back to the web or the presentation. Thank you. So I am going to do just a little bit of an overview because for those of you, if there's a few people on that say, hey, it isn't a conversation that I have on a regular basis, this may feel like an overview for some of you. But in terms of ethics defined, I like to start with a definition. And so if you take a look at these bullets, if we toss out the word ethics, Merriam-Webster says that discipline dealing with what is good and bad and with moral duty and obligation. Well, that's pretty high. And the second bullet is a set of moral principles and or a theory or system of moral values. So there's that word moral in twice. And then this third one, the principles of conduct governing an individual or a group. And this last one, a guiding philosophy. So, Kim, I see Karen asking a question in the chat room.
Yes, I just saw that too, and I love it. I mean, it truly is hitting on it when she says, how can you not consider ethics in what you do daily? You would at least think about how ethics apply to your daily decisions. So even if you may not be thinking of the formal, name of the particular ethic that guides your work, but every decision we make in terms of supporting our clients and youth, even in the schools, there's a lot of ethics built into every decision.
So thank you, but I love the fact that someone online, had a visceral reaction to this because that's exactly the demonstration that I wanted to talk about with this definition, and I'll talk about some of the codes that guide us, is that the word ethics is sometimes used as a sword and sometimes used as a shield. We tend to lob the term, you're doing something unethical, oh, that's a very ethical practices, as an immediate definition of someone someone who's done something good or someone who's done something bad. And I love to have this conversation because by the end of this, you'll see that ethics is not always black and white. That the reason that we want to have this conversation and want you to consider this continued conversation is that ethics is one of those areas that has us having conversations that are sometimes gray. But as we go through the conversation today, 1.5 hours of reminding ourselves of the mission of our work. So those folks that are jumping in and saying, well, it is part of my daily operations. It hits here and it hits there. So let's talk just a little bit about the ethics that guide the industry we're in, and then begin to overlay those topics that we were talking about that make a difference today. So we are quite fortunate, and as I look at the 236 people that we have on the line today, and I'm scrolling through who I see on, we have people who are at the VR director level, and we have practitioners, and we have school people online, and we have family members possibility. We may have VR recipients on the line. So everybody is coming to this discussion with different modalities that guide the work that they do. So I'd like to introduce a couple guides for the sake of discussion today. The APSE Ethical Guidelines for Professionals in Supported Employment. So that has been around for about 25 years right now, and APSE is the Association for Persons Supporting Employment First. That is a 2-page document that takes kind of all the considerations and puts it into a real working operational document for practitioners. And then for those of us, and it seems like we have a bunch of you online who are CRCs, we have the Commission on Rehabilitation Counseling Certification, the CRCC Code of Professional Ethics, rewritten in 2017. For those of you that like to come at it from another direction, WinTAC, our partners at the WinTAC Technical Assistance Center, took time to put together a supported employment quality features document. And if you go on the WinTAC website, you'll see there's 2 other documents that accompany that document that are checklists and quality standards that talk to you about how to measure fidelity and quality in good employment practices. That's specific to supported employment. There is also one that is specific to customized employment on. So you see we are digging deep and overlaying like I was talking about, those different layers of things that guide us in the work we do. And then APSE took time to turn all of those ethical guidelines into a list of universal employment competencies. So take a look at that. You know, as I talk about one of the ethical standards, it's about being a qualified staff person. That will help us understand from whichever seat we sit in, whether we are qualified or whether we are purchasing or negotiating qualified services. And then the last thing I'll introduce to you, and it's one of my very favorites and it's important in this particular topic, is the CIRI monograph series. And so CIRI, not the one on your phone, this is the Center for International Rehabilitation, Research, Information, Exchange. Long name, but we call it CIRI. And if you have a minute to tap on that while we're talking, or if you took a look at some of the examples that I put in the downloadable materials, great resources on understanding multiple cultural groups and the concepts of cultural brokering. So I know that we have a broad audience today, and I'm wondering, especially Kim, because you represent the school side of things, what other guides or codes come to mind that might influence the audience that are on the phone today?
I can't necessarily think of guides, but there is a good comment that Lindsay brought up, which is the conflict that can sometimes occur between what policy says and what your ethics drive the work that you do, and how difficult it is oftentimes for the staff to navigate those waters and make the best ethical decisions for their clients.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Kim's dog has a lot to say about ethics today. So, so thank you, Lindsay, for saying that, because there's the black and whiteness of the way we feel, but the gray in which we work is that often our policies don't align with our mission and vision and values, and that's why I love having this conversation, because of the time that we should spend in these ethical decision and discussion times to influence our policy development. And so you hear a little bit about some movements towards that as we move on in the webinar. So just a quick review for those of you, if this is new information, or if the term of ethics or the professional codes of ethics are maybe the first time you're seeing it. I also appreciate the fact that sometimes when we are following a code of professional ethics or a code of conduct, we sign off on it at the beginning or at our licensure point. Might be the beginning of a job. I know that many agencies have people sign a code of conduct, or at the beginning of a licensure you sign off on the code of conduct. In CRCC they require us to get 10 hours of ethical training in a 5-year time, and so I say that thinking about, and I'm going to ask this question a couple times, what happens over a 5-year period, when you consider how society changes, how you change. So just consider, that when you think about ethical principles. So by way of a quick review, the CRCC Code of Professional Ethics is 44 pages long. And I would imagine if you're at the beginning of your career, taking the CRC exam and getting the approval and passing that exam and taking a look at the code of conduct, that's a deep read. And there are 7 ethical principles guiding us for professional ethics by CRCC. So I'm going to buzz through them pretty quickly, but we can send more information if you want deeper review of that, and you do have a copy of the code. So as I buzz through defining these, I'd like you to think of how these words and principles affect youth. When you say autonomy, what does it mean in the life of a youth? Or the life of serving and supporting youth or young adults. So autonomy, this is a client, and we're using the word client today because that's the word that's used throughout the ethical guide. A client's right to be self-governing within their own social and cultural, there's that word cultural, framework. A client's right to participate in informed consent and to be free from unwanted influence. So autonomy, the right to be self-governing. Beneficence. Beneficence means to do good and to promote the well-being of clients. Beneficence also asks us to be trained and competent staff. So as I heard VR Systems talk to us about an ever-increasing caseload, moving up to 55-60% of their caseloads are now this new age group, I ask, are we truly ready to receive? Have we truly learned how to do good work when we're serving a new population? This one of fidelity, this is my favorite one to talk about when it comes to ethics. So fidelity is to be faithful, to have trust, to have loyalty. So I'll pause there just for a minute and consider, when serving youth, how does fidelity come into play? So a little bit of a rhetorical question, but think about that as we go through for our discussion. Justice is fair in the treatment of all clients, equal access to all services for all people. Back in the day when we had lots of money and lots of time and lots of staff, we would have the concept of creaming, that we would pick the easiest to serve clients to make sure we were meeting the numbers, and then we could, on the side make sure we were serving people that were more difficult. Well, with new laws and new regulations, we've kind of flipped that on its head and said that it's actually the folks that are most in need that will receive the services. And if we go back through the other ethical concepts that begins to hit up against the how do I do good work in a time where it's become more difficult. So justice, non-maleficence, and this one is the do no harm to others and support the dignity of risk. So again, depending on the seat that you're sitting in, to think about that, do no harm to others, support the dignity of risk. And there's a concept that I like to introduce when I'm talking about non-maleficence, and it's this concept of, have we considered the unintended impact of good intentions? So Kim, when I say the unintended impact of good intentions, what might come to mind for you?
I think it's sometimes, we make choices that we think are in the best interest of our clients and or students when that may not be what they're interested in. We had a good intention. Maybe it was making a connection to a certain business or providing some opportunity. Maybe it wasn't in alignment with the family's values, but without necessarily knowing, you think you're moving forward doing the right thing. What we think is best.
And I see a couple of people typing in, so the unintended impact of good intentions. I'll talk about it for a minute while I see people typing in. If you follow the history of our field, so if you're a lover of history and you take a look at all the movements that we've gone through in our field of moving towards sheltered employment that helped to get people out of institutions and into an employment situation, that was a good intention at the time. We want to make an employment opportunity, and then what were the unintended impacts of that good intention is that we created another perhaps institutional model, and we moved into supported employment for an example, and we operated under the enclave model. So here's a good intention of creating a group model of employment services, and there was also another unintended impact of that there became a reputation of seeing persons with disabilities in groups as opposed to one-on-one. And I could go on and on and on talking about that as an example, but I like that as a guiding principle when you're thinking about the work that we're doing and we have good intentions. What rolls out, as the impact of the work we do? My father would talk about we have freedom of choice, but not freedom from consequences. So I always use that as a guiding, when I made that choice, what were the consequences, whether they were good or bad, or what was the outcome? Kim, you want to go for a couple of the comments that are coming in?
Yep. Do you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Seth has commented that young people are often wary of anything institutional because of all the unintended impacts of good intentions that they've already experienced, and that's a great point. By the time that they get connected with VR or developmental disabilities or other services, they and or their families are very weary or hesitant to engage in because of previous good intentions. And then Dale added that he struggles sometimes with the philosophy of consumer client choice isn't always a priority. And you had made a comment earlier too about being prepared to work with new groups or new populations, and oftentimes in vocational rehabilitation there may be individuals who have primarily worked with adult populations who are now, maybe they're being assigned to a new caseload, or they're filling in on the caseload or moving offices, and that's the caseload they get. Oftentimes is transition, or at least made up partly of transition. And you hear throughout the VR world, applying the adult model to serving transition, it doesn't look the same. There's other responsibilities and other partners and other things that come into play that oftentimes some of the VR pre-service programs aren't necessarily preparing them for. So I think that fed into it as well. Going back to the chat, I see Scott has said there's, with the growth of social enterprises in terms of, like, say, the coffee shops where they're only hiring people with disabilities, or they're open specifically to, we're going to employ people with disabilities. Yes, definitely a great example, Scott, of the unintended or the unintended consequences of good intentions. And then non-maleficence in regards to clients who are more argumentative, taking the back burner to favorite.
I thank you. That, I appreciate the fact that we're listening with examples that we're living in our real life, and you're doing exactly what my hope was for this discussion, is taking that time to say these are the things that happen to me when I begin to actually take the time of thinking of my personal philosophy, of what I witness, of what I observe. So thank you for taking time to take a risk and type into the chat box. One more that I'll mention is veracity. So veracity was a term and a principle that was added to the 2017 code. It wasn't previously in the 2010, which is interesting because I had never necessarily used the word veracity in my vocabulary up until that point. And veracity means to be honest. That seems so obvious in the work that we do, to be honest, and yet when I've explored this word with learners and with folks in conversations, that honesty sometimes takes a back seat to protecting people from information. And so when we think of veracity, some of the key components of veracity is that we disclose mistakes. When we make an error or a mistake, that we're comfortable as rehab practitioners to disclose those mistakes, that we avoid omissions. Veracity really comes up in the times that we're talking about assessment outcomes. That when we want to convey information which may not be happy information or good necessarily, or that we're judging not to be good, sometimes we omit information as we're conveying it and articulating that. So thank you for that kind of entry-level overview of professional ethics, but I'm going to be referring back to that. And then you'll see in this right-hand column the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 ethical guideline standards, and it's, as I mentioned, 2 pages or 2.5 pages of how APSE takes those CRC, Code of Professional Ethics, ethical guidelines, and turns them into more practical, every day in my delivery of service, that individuality, choice. I saw some people type in and talk about choice. On the list, respect, participation, competence, and social inclusion. So I encourage you to, in your light reading, take a look at the CRC Code of Ethics as well as the APSE ethical guidelines. Kim, one comment from Melissa about veracity. Do you want to mention that one?
Yes, that's a great point, Melissa, in terms of how sometimes the parents don't want the disability named, or maybe it hasn't been named, and maybe they've talked around it for the years while they've been in school. And so that veracity aspect of things, of being honest and honest in our work, can become challenging, especially for a VR counselor, if prior to them interacting with the students, that's what the student experience was, maybe not even being invited to their own IEP meeting because their parents didn't want them to know they had a disability. So there's a lot that comes into play there with that being honest in our jobs and in our roles, and with in abiding by our ethics, for sure. I see Stephanie. Yes, informed choice, absolutely. That drives the process there. And then Sarah also mentioned that one challenge of being honest with the transition population is their parents and guardians are not always ready to hear what the truth of the situation is, and therefore end up limiting the youth service provision. And I just want to say, yes, that can be a factor. That does happen. It's not across the board, obviously. There are some parents that, definitely have their eyes open and they know exactly what the situation is with their own child. But we do encounter where there's a disconnect between what the school thinks, what the family thinks, what VR thinks, and that can pose some challenges as well.
So thank you, and it's like I had plants in the audience, especially when we were talking about parents or other people in the youth or young adult's life, is that I can give you the black and white list, the 44 pages of the ethical code and 3 pages of the ethical guidelines, as well as those other resources that tell us, if you are doing great vocational rehabilitation. Here's all the ways you can check and make sure you're doing it. But then we have this whole world of spheres of influence. Folks who are bringing to us their opinion, their input, their value system, their information, their lived experience, and their reality. So again, in that black and white versus gray, no message here in saying that anyone brings to us wrong information. Everyone brings to us different ways to look at a situation. So when you consider all of these folks surrounding you in the middle, so 80% of you said, yes, of course, Wendy, that was a silly question. Ethics play a part in work that I do every single day. And yet, when you have friends saying, hey, maybe you shouldn't do it that way, or the families that you just mentioned, you know, I haven't talked to my son or daughter about disability yet. When you have region of the country or religious beliefs or society at large or as a whole, the law, the one that you don't see in here is culture, and we'll be talking about that a little more. But I love this image of you in the middle surrounded by all of the people working to influence the way that you are making professional decisions and, you know, bringing information to you about a way to think about it differently. I'm not introducing this image to say that it's so bad that we have many people influencing us. I actually think it's a great opportunity to do exactly what we're talking about today, is exploring all the intersectionality of why a family may have made the choice not to talk about disability. You know, why your fellow coworkers have an opinion on the matter and where that opinion came from. So in the vein of veracity and in the vein of being having high fidelity work, you know, let's explore what brings these folks in that sphere of influence to their thinking about the particular topics that we're talking about. And, oh, sorry. And I just wanted to talk for just a couple minutes about this evolution between 2010 and 2017 in the values influencing the CRC code and the CRC principles. So there were some changes that got made in the evolution from 2010 to 2017. And you may be living this yourself, or if you're newer in the field, you may have never known that they weren't part of our ethics codes. But our 2017 code talked about promoting empowerment through self-advocacy and self-determination. Well, gosh, yes, if you think about WIOA and all the work that we're doing for advocacy and self-determination, I'm happy to see that the ethics code said if we're going to be successful rehab counselors, we're paying attention to that. Here's that discussion that we had a few minutes ago about veracity in the assessment process, is emphasizing client strengths versus deficits. I told you I've been in the field for 34 years. I used to be a VOC evaluator, and boy, did we do a lot of reporting on what people couldn't do versus what people could do. And that evolution to asset-based communication, that's a transition of communication, and I ask us to listen to ourselves in the way that we convey assessment findings and the way that we have conversations with families and teachers and folks about the people we're providing support to. Are we focusing on strengths versus deficits? It sounds so easy, but so often it doesn't happen that way. Serving individuals holistically, an emphasis on where people work, play, pray, live, have friends, and all of the above. We are no longer seeing a job as a standalone, but we're seeing everything in a person's life affecting how successful they are in their lives, and work is one of those things that are included. So I love that that's changed in our field and the work that we're doing in that, and I think that very much fits into transitioning into adult life. And then this comprehensive emphasis on cultural awareness. So you can see in 2010 there was the appreciation of diversity of the human experience in culture, but if you look at the 2017 ethics code, it is woven throughout. It's not just in one place, but it's emphasized in many places throughout the code. So Kim, I want to take a breather. Is there anything about that slide that you wanted to add on to? To cough for a minute?
No, I think it's pretty comprehensive, and it shows kind of the evolution over time of how things are changing, and how
Yep.
I think the laws are coming into alignment with the codes as well.
Absolutely. And one of the statements in the code, and I love to read this and just take a look at it, and I'll read it out loud together. Rehabilitation counselors, that these are the values influencing the CRC principles. Rehabilitation counselors are aware that all individuals exist in a variety of contexts and understand that the influence of these contexts on the individual's behavior. So often I hear people talk about a client's behavior, and I love the fact that the code took time aside to talk about, where is that individual coming from and what brings that person's behavior to that point. And that rehabilitation counselors are aware of the continuing evolution of the field, changes in society at large, the different needs of individuals in social, political, and historical, and environmental, and economic contexts, and that this commitment involves providing respectful and timely communication, taking appropriate action where cultural diversity issues occur, and being accountable for the outcomes as they affect people of all races, ethnicities, genders, national origins, religions, sexual orientations, or other cultural groups or identities. Whew, that's a long one, and I'm not typically a trainer that likes to read a slide out loud, but I do absolutely like to emphasize this slide because I would ask us to consider what we are living in now. If you closed your eyes and imagined what's happened over the last 5 years of time, as you as a practitioner in the world that we live in the work that we're doing, what can you imagine is shifting as it relates to this statement? So Kim, what's shifted in school settings as it relates to this statement?
I was thinking about that very question as you were asking it, and I think that obviously a big shift for all of us, you mentioned earlier, was the segregated work and the real push, the employment first movements that have happened over the years, the state resolutions that we've seen regarding segregated employment or sub-minimum wage employment. Those things are huge in the employment world. With WIOA coming out in 2014 and its emphasis on competitive integrated employment, inclusion of special populations. There's language, and that's kind of our target population, the special population groups. I think another one is around the role of family and how we've got to have families on board to support the work that we're all doing to help students with disabilities not only be successful in school, but be able to take advantage of the services that are available to them to be successful in further education, training, and employment. And that is a challenge, as you can see in the comments that the people were already mentioning about the role of family and sometimes that disconnect between what the individual wants and what their family wants versus informed choice. Another thing that really sticks out to me is the focus and influence of culturally and linguistic diverse practices and awareness, and I know we're going to delve more into the cultural piece here, but that's been on the forefront for special education for many years and highlighted by work of NTAC, as we've mentioned before, the National Technical Assistance Center in Transition, as well as the Division on Career Development and Transition, and lots of resources out there. Not to mention the immigration issues that we've been facing over the last 5 years, and social media and its influence and media around that. And really, you hear people say, if you've seen one person with autism, you've seen one person with autism. I could use that same phrase to talk about immigrants or people who have come here illegally. There are so many different situations and so many different stories that we can't just use a stereotype or a certain concept around a person because of a prior experience or what the media has portrayed. And so I like to use that analogy in that term too. I think too, we've really seen gender identity and LGBTQ and other communities and groups really standing up and being supported, and you've seen changes in, say, state legislation and things like that around these populations. So when you talk about what has changed in the last 5 years, a lot has changed. A lot for educators and both rehab providers and the counselors and anybody working in the service industry to be aware of and learn about and tackle and really become knowledgeable so that we are taking that holistic approach so that we're not doing things that maybe cause our clients or students to relive a trauma they've experienced previously or cause them to feel like they're isolated, things like that. And I have an example of something I wanted to mention today, and I like to use it. And I want to say specifically for students with disabilities that might necessarily be in foster care or in juvenile justice or homeless or maybe in an abusive home or where there's drug and alcohol abuse. And think of, and you may have seen this on social media as it was kind of getting closer to back to school, but some of the activities that teachers may do in their classroom at the beginning of the school year to say something like, write a paragraph or draw a picture or do something to tell us about what was your favorite thing that you did this summer, or an activity about let's all work on our family tree, or everybody let's bring baby pictures in and try to figure out who's who. Well, when we do those things, we're not necessarily being sensitive to the various groups that we serve that may be sitting in our classrooms, because a student in foster care may have experienced so much trauma that summer that trying to remember anything about the summer is going to be very traumatic, or they may not have the baby pictures to bring in. And so just really being cognizant of who's in my classroom and how can I be sensitive to those things and learn how to better support them. So I know that was a question you asked. I gave you a really answer. But there are so many facets of things that happen in law and practice and then in our daily activities that we just have to be really aware of.
Thank you, and thank you, Kim. That's a great picture of. It's not as easy as saying, what are we facing? That I was in a conversation yesterday where we talked about if you drop a rock in the water and that ripple effect out. So one question just begat for Kim all sorts of, ranging from standing on our soapbox and saying this is what I believe in to the realities of operations. And that's what I love about the fact that the CRC code has told us, and I'm going to hone us down to the concept of cultural competency, because we did say we would overlay that, is as a society, if you took that last 5 years as a snapshot, and I do that because if you started 5 years ago and you needed to get your ethical, all your ethical credits done in that 5-year period, what we're facing in the industry has shifted so much in 5 years that I hope we're having this conversation on an ongoing basis. And because of this focus in on cultural competency and diversity, the CRC code is asking us to act differently, to become culturally competent, to practice interventions or our actions that incorporate consideration of cultural perspectives. And Kim, you just gave us a couple cool examples of how easily we can do something that was back in our history of practices. What did you do this summer? Versus how do we ask questions in different ways to get at what we're actually looking for? And we'll talk about that a little more in a minute. And then this non-discrimination. This may all sound so black and white. Rehabilitation counselors do not condone or engage in the prejudicial treatment of an individual or a group based on their actual or perceived membership in a particular group, class, or category. category. I hope that never needs to be said out loud, but I think it needs to be said out loud, is that it's as we negotiate through what we're learning, feeling, experiencing, and doing in our positions, it is taking time to focus on how do our actions mirror our thoughts, and how do our thoughts mirror ethical principles guiding our industry. And so I wanted to introduce this concept of gracious space, because we're about to dive a next step in that transparency layer into this discussion of cultural competence and the intersection of culture and the work that we're doing. And you know, if you were in my room, I'd say raise your hand if you've heard of this concept of gracious space. But this is and I didn't put the web, you have a resource in your resource packet, but the Institute for Ethical Leadership put out this guide for gracious space, and it is truly this concept that we create a spirit and a setting where we invite the stranger to learn in public. So when you're joining 245 of your closest friends and 2 of us speakers, none of whom we can see each other, we're taking a risk at having a conversation about culture, because we can, and there's less risk in the fact that we're not in the room together, because we're not necessarily seeing reactions or, you know, someone raising their hand or someone saying, I want to talk about something. So it actually requires us to be even more intentional. So I see a couple of people saying, is common practice in Buddhism to pay attention to gracious space. So let me just explain it, because I love this concept. So when we talk about the spirit of a setting of gracious space, it's creating welcoming, inclusive environments where curiosity is allowed for, and that means a bunch of different things to different people. The setting of gracious space is creating a place where we can connect to our energy, and where we truly, when we're at our best, it's a setting where I feel that it's gracious, I feel that I can be at my best, and that involves practicing hospitality, you know, honoring people's voice, honoring people's need for space, honoring, you know, I see a whole bunch of people typing into the chat room talking about IEPs. So I invite you to take a few minutes to look at that guidelines for gracious space and ask yourself, you know, because I saw a lot of energy about how IEPs are not going as well. And if we're considering this move from IEP to IPE, plans for employment in the VR setting, you know, have we promoted a place where we can explore curiosity, be inclusive, be welcoming, and talk about some topics that may not be as easy to talk about, going down to that ethical principle of veracity. And the concept of the stranger is like, why would I want a stranger to come in and learn with us? But it's actually a really cool concept. In the topic of cultural competence specifically, or in anything you're talking about, that stranger is the individual who's not typically involved in the conversation. We need to invite strangers into deeper conversations in order to learn different perspectives. So that strangers in quotes, because, you know, I know we have stranger danger, but the stranger in this case is a very valuable person in the process of creating an environment where we can have gracious, curious conversations that will lead us to better practices. And this concept of learning in public is creating environments that allow for humility and exploring assumptions. When it comes to understanding culture, there's a lot of humility that needs to take place, and a lot of letting go of this is the right way of doing things, this is the way I believe it should be done, you know, why are they doing it that way? You know, I saw some chat going on in the chat box about people's feelings about families. There were some people saying that they believe that families are barriers, and there's people that say that families are assets. I explore you to, or I challenge us to explore that level of discussion. Create a gracious space where we can say, why am I feeling that reaction of families being an asset or a barrier? Because as we dive into culture, you're going to hear us talking about the impact of, within certain cultures, what role the family plays. Kim, is there anything you'd like to say about gracious space?
No, I agree with everything you said, and I've been following all these chats, and I appreciate Maria and some others who were mentioning some topics that you could Google and find some resources out there in regards to self-led IEPs and motivational interviewing, and just following that feed, Wendy, it's just indicative of the challenges that our VR counselors are finding when they're attending IEP meetings. And it's not their, they're not the lead, technically the school is, and so they're having to sit in that environment and experience where maybe there's no student present, or if there is, they're minimally engaged, and it's not with them, it's for them. And then the other side of, the parents making the decisions versus the informed choice. So these are all very, very valid points, and nothing that we can necessarily solve here today, but opening up that gracious space, and I would always encourage when I work with the VR agency here in Oklahoma is, as a VR representative in those meetings, you're the expert on employment, and you're the expert at pulling out the strengths and that informed choice of that individual, and so you can influence that meeting and continued work with that individual. And so I just grant you that gracious space to take a step and open.
And thank you. And I also invite you to tell us how you're using the concept of gracious space. What has changed for your settings. What are you doing to do this? Because a couple of people have talked about the motivational interviewing concepts. Kim, you've talked about trauma-informed practices. So thank you for those of you who are exploring it in your work, and for those of you who have not heard of gracious space and want to take a stab at it. Take a look at the resource we gave you and begin to put it into your practices, because when oops, I'm having trouble. When we're thinking about specifically cultural competence, gracious, as we're navigating our way down this continuum of cultural competence, someone the other day said, can we call it cultural curiosity? But if you're talking to us, people who come from academic institutions, we love the word competence and want to move us down to this place where we are culturally proficient, when we've changed and we have ongoing practices that are culturally flexible and responsive. But we know that there's a road to getting there. And so I think the first two bullets speak for themselves, the cultural destructiveness that happens on that continuum, attitudes and policies and practices that are ruinous. I'm going to put my hands together and hope that none of us are working in a setting where there's cultural destructiveness, but I can't say that I know that always to be true, because we hear all sorts of things, as we teach our courses. Cultural incapacity is the literal fact that we don't have the capacity to serve particular cultural groups because we hadn't put thought to the way we were going to change our practices, and we hadn't explored it yet. And then this concept of cultural blindness. So Kim and I had a discussion yesterday about I did this class recently and asked what people thought of cultural blindness, and somebody raised their hand, and this was in person, and said, I am really proud of myself. I consider myself to have cultural blindness. I don't see anybody as the color or the race or the religion. I treat everybody equally and everybody fairly. And, I'm wondering if I'm going to see people type in really quickly. It was very interesting because we had created gracious space in the classroom, and people, unfortunately for her, jumped all over that statement and said, cultural blindness is the exact step in the continuum of cultural competence that leaps us into the becoming competent phase. And so, yeah, and I'll talk about some comments that are coming in, but the concept of cultural blindness, is that we're functioning, that all cultures are the same and culture makes no difference. Well, indeed, that's not the case, that culture does make a difference. And people are typing in that they want to be careful that we're not considering culture as any one thing. And I do want to talk about the fact that for me, the definition of culture is any group that we belong to. whether it's cultures of poverty, whether it's cultures of religion, whether it's cultures of hobby-based groups that I belong to, whether it's a culture of a disability, race, religion, ethnicity. Again, 1.5 hours is only scraping off the top of this concept of cultural diversity, and we can go very deep into all sorts of conversations about, what culture means to us. So as we walk through this continuum of cultural competence, our goal is to find the sweet spot in the culturally competent cultural proficiency. But for the sake of having this discussion today, I want to talk a little bit about the concepts of cultural. So, and Kim, are there anything coming up in the comments that you want to?
There is. There's just a point, that even that coming from someone who works in the blind and vision impaired arena, even the use of that term in this regard. So cultural curiosity would be more appropriate, but that's what's in the literature. And when I was thinking of this, it makes me think of an image that you and I have looked at before. And if you Google cultural iceberg, it'll bring up several images out there that show an iceberg. And it shows you kind of that break in what's above the waterline and what's below. And the things that are above are the things of the culture that we can see or that we know about because, it's on the surface. But then the things that are below the surface, the things that are above, it might be something like, food or dress or music, something like that. But then below the surface, it's those values and beliefs and rituals and things that we may not know of. And it's very similar when I think of hidden disabilities, and we can find icebergs around that too of, if you're someone who has a learning disability, there may not be things on the surface that appear that you have a disability, but there's so many underlying things. And I think that's a really good point here as a visual.
I love it, and I see folks typing in. Thank you very much. Is that folks, and I'm just reading these, that I believe that there are common threads that unite us from all different cultures, and you're absolutely hitting on the point of this overlay that we wanted to talk about, is that cultural competence is achieved by identifying and understanding the needs and help-seeking behaviors of all individuals and families. That competent organizations design and implement services that are tailored and matched to unique needs, but there is a stage at which we need to explore this. And so I want to dive in with the time left today to talk about the distinct interconnected components of culture, again with that definition that culture is the group that I belong to. And there were several people saying we pretty quickly jump to doing comparisons. I'm from this group and I don't believe, understand this group, and so therefore we assign bias to that group. And I'd also overlay, and it may be a little bit of a danger zone, is that we have some U.S. values or American values that we overlay when we talk about what we believe about culture. But for the sake of discussion and for the sake of talking about what does this have to do with the work we do, the culture is made up of distinct interconnected components. So go back to the origin of this workshop today, and in serving and supporting youth as we go through the vocational rehab process, in thinking, well, what does this have to do with the work at hand? The normative codes within a culture, the ways of behaving, food practices, religion and religious practices, child rearing practices. I want to take a pause just for a second there and say, okay, well, what do those three things have to do with the work I'm doing in vocational rehabilitation? Why would it be essential for me to understand the normative codes in someone's cultural group? And Kim, do you have an insight on that?
I don't have an insight. I think that the participants are speaking, loudly with what their insight is, and you can see just in the comments that they're making. And it's not that any one of them is proving that they're, this cultural pro, but what they're proving is that they're using strategies to make sure that they have an open mind and open eyes when it comes to them, and knowing that these things exist and that they're changing over time. I love the reference to the Gen X and the millennials, and those are things we experience on a daily basis in terms of the different groups. And so I think that I'm seeing an underlying current here of just, we all have the same things in common, and that the same desire to be heard, to be listened to be successful in whatever success means to us, and being there to listen.
Absolutely. I saw people, thank you very much, jumping on exactly what I hoped you did, is those normative codes, is that child rearing practices or food practices impact work. If we think of the connection into, what beliefs are passed on through the family about what work means within my culture. So if you look at that last bullet of methods of transmitting culture to the young, messages that have gone down through time, in terms of our culture, what we may do in our culture, what visions we have, what perceptions we have. Communication codes, the verbal and non-verbal communication codes, and I've heard vocational rehabilitation specialists talk about, I have a full expectation that someone calls me when I expect them to call me, and yet if we haven't taken time to understand what the different codes are, and codes are just a term for practices that people have within their particular culture, that we may be missing some nuances. This concept of go ahead.
Well, and I think I was going to say, too, just to add on to that, too, those impact the role in the family, and knowing what their role in the family is and what the responsibilities of that individual within the family are and will look like if they look different, once they're out of school. And so it's being aware of how those things.
Yeah, and someone asked the question of how child rearing practices, have to do with the work that we're doing. And I put that in there, I leave it in there kind of in that consideration that the way that families transmit culture to the young or have had kids brought up really do, and we'll talk about that in a minute, affect how young people see themselves as workers. I see I'm also running out of time, Kim, and I want to be careful to make it through our slides. The problem-solving strategies, how within a culture group, are problems solved? Is it an individualistic or a collective environment where an individual makes decisions, a family makes decisions, or a family group makes decisions, something very important. Relationships within that family group that we just talked about. And then I have dozens of other examples within culture. What are the stories of a culture? What are the courtesies practiced within a culture? Rituals, customs, beliefs, gender perceptions, age perceptions, power, how is power seen within a culture, education, modesty, physical differences, history, all of the above. So if we take time to just take a breather within that, is how is independence received and reminded within a culture, because our perceptions of independence may be quite far away from a particular cultural group and their understanding about independence. And so as you kind of think through that list and ask yourselves, how in my practices am I considering when it comes to youth all of those things that Wendy just mentioned, the typical components of culture that, again, as Kim discovered that, or discussed that iceberg, 10% of culture is what we can see, 90% of it is below the surface. And that if we don't find a way to have the open conversations in that gracious space about how we change our practices or what we consider. And so I want to make sure before we run out of time to talk about these key considerations. So we do a whole class. Oops. Can you hold on for a second on that one? Can you still hear me? Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
We do a whole class on authentic youth engagement where we focus in, so this is where I want to talk about the intersection real quick, where we focus in on the fact that I started the conversation talking about ethics. We did a real, quick dip into the fact that culture has a big impact, but if we start to overlay those two conversations with each other, that considering typical youth development concepts, that as we're knocking the door on this 55% or 60% of our caseloads and serving youth, what are the nuances of serving youth? The brain science associated with that, the potential vocational development gaps. Kim, you talk about we must first Maslow before we, what's the statement? Bloom? Yes. Yes. So that when we're helping, do you want to talk about that for a second?
I'm sure most of you are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy and Bloom's taxonomy, and it's just talking about and referring to, we've got to have our basic needs met before we can, thrive and achieve our goals. And we've just, everything from that safety, security, knowing where I'm sleeping at night, knowing that I have a meal, knowing that I have people that care about me before I can be thinking about some other, other
Exactly. Goals. And so as we're overlaying our conversation about ethics, culture, and supporting youth, have we educated ourselves going back to the ethical principles? Are we aware of typical youth development concepts? And then an additional overlay, and I mentioned it a minute ago, the expectations of independence within the cultural group, within the school setting, within our adult world versus the school world. This is the one that I want to make sure to highlight, is the concept of disability within the culture. And the brokering resources that I provided to you through series have this fantastic group of monographs that will provide information about, and please go back to the gracious-based concept of not every single piece of information and every resource that we read is accurate and covers every single person that represents a cultural group. But take a look at the disability or the cultural brokering resources because those two bullets of disability within the culture and beliefs about rehabilitation are very woven throughout those. And in talking about that, and the one that I gave you a sample of was of the Haitian culture. So a few minutes ago, we had lots of people talking in about their perceptions of the concept of disclosure, parents keeping disability from people and other people saying it's a must that we talk about it within an IEP discussion or in the voc rehab system. And if you read a little bit about how disability is seen specifically in this example within the Haitian culture, you'll see that some disabilities are seen as a punishment. And so that if we overlay that with our practices of embrace your disability, disclose away, talk to the world about your disability, that we may be overlaying our beliefs into, an ethical dilemma that's hitting up against what a particular family group or culture sees about disabilities. Now, if Yep, and some people are actually typing in that it's a punishment for the sins of the parents, the perception of that. Now, I imagine that you guys are going, oh, I've never heard that. I don't believe that. That's not true. But the fact is, if it's true to the person sitting in the chair across from you, some of our typical practices hit right up against what folks have been believing about disability and beliefs about rehabilitation. So I highly encourage you as an activity is to take a look at those resources and look at the overall resource that's the Guide to Cultural Brokering to take a look at culture, ethics, and practices. I wrote this bullet about the power of language, and the language of power is that so easily that the roles of power seats come into play. You know, our role as a rehabilitation provider, the I know, you know, I'm the expert, and Kim even referred to it a few minutes ago, that perception of expertise within a culture and the way that people see maybe that they can't necessarily partner with us because of their perception of us being in the seat of power. You know, how can we take a look at that? And then this consideration of acculturation within any given cultural group. What is the internal expectation of someone acculturating into a community or into a culture versus I have a choice to stay within my community and practice the beliefs that I believe in. So I mention all of these with the thought that this is a discussion that we need to have. And could you put up our question number 2? So as we talk about cultural consideration in our last 5 minutes, and I may go a few minutes over if you'll stay with me, what barriers do you encounter when trying to implement culturally responsive employment services? Thank you for taking time to type into that. So thank you, and we can stop the poll there. I just wanted to get a taste of, you know, as we dip into this concept of making sure that we are providing culturally competent or culturally aware services. What are some of the typical things that we're hitting up against? And Kim, that disappeared quickly before I saw it, but I saw a couple people talking about my lack of understanding of various cultures and even the lack of cultural competence of my own environment. Did you notice anything before it tapped away?
It was funny because in the beginning, you know, there was a clear line of distinction, but then it was like middle of the road. They were all coming up equal, but I think it was more along the lines of time, lack of administration, like support in terms of those areas, and then lack of own knowledge and cultural competence. I think were the three that I noticed.
Thank you. And so I asked that question previous to this slide where one of the challenges and one of the questions that I want to bring up for you is that can we take time in our own internal environmental settings, you know, in our gracious spaces or maybe even not so gracious spaces to take a look at that cultural competence continuum and take a look at our own environments and do some scanning. In the back of the Siri Guide to Cultural Brokering is a whole list of assessment questions to talk to you, yourself, or your program about our practices in developing and offering culturally competent services. You know, we talked about the key considerations for youth. when we're encountering this topic, because of the fact that we have such an increased population. So as you are conducting your environmental scans, and if you are serving a greater amount of youth, let's overlay this consideration of how are we including support networks. What are we doing about confidentiality and privileged communication when we are serving minors? It may seem so obvious, when you go back to those ethical principles about, that confidentiality is 100%, but when you consider this concept of fidelity, you have a parent saying that I want the information, you have principals that say I have a confidential situation, and you have situations where you want to share information, you're running into that ethical dilemma. What is our responsibility to minors or clients lacking capacity to consent? This concept of assent, it's not a word that I normally used in our practices, but how do we move from supporting someone who may not have the capacity to consent or have not necessarily been in voc rehab services and has not necessarily actively participated in their plan development, to an environment of supporting someone to understand the decision-making processes and to have a voice. IEL and YTAC have an amazing model called the Learning Lab model, where we are supporting and teaching companies and organizations how to invite youth voice into the process. So obviously a couple other ethical considerations is, again, that responsibility to legal guardians or parents. Where is our fidelity? The concepts of social media and the thoughts about dual relationships. So I ask you to take this list back to the environments that you're practicing in and study what other ethical considerations might we be running into. So Kim, I think I've come to the end and run out of time, and I guess I want to leave us with this thought. And Kim, do you have a thought of the most important thing to leave with? No problem.
Sorry, sometimes getting to that mute button. I think it's just, I can see just from the chats of the participants how open they are to this topic and how, their ethics are guiding their work, and just being more mindful. I think it's taking a mindful approach as we serve those.
Absolutely, and I want to say that, as we engage in the different steps in the work that we do, that the possible ethical conflicts that may arise, and, ethical conflicts and ethical dilemmas are ones of which that are not black and white, that are gray, is that everyone, all 250 people online today, are involved in vocational rehabilitation at the prep point or at the extended services point, and every step in between. And we have so many opportunities to take a look at this overlaid discussion, considering ethics, considering culture, and considering practices, in terms of team meetings. Who should not be left out? If we're in a collective cultural group, and when our old practices used to be I serve the client and only the client, when we get to know deeper understandings of culture and how they see rehab services and how decisions are made, both the plan development and the team meetings, who shouldn't be left out? How are decisions made within that culture? Who follows up at home? Disclosure. So thank you. We had quite a few people type in and talk to us about the fact that how disability is seen within a family group or within a culture has a big consideration on how stigma is seen. Community liaisons and networks when it comes to job development. Job coaching. If we haven't learned in the culture about the concepts of touch, physical distance, oral versus written, learning styles, someone wrote in, that stuff is very important. And then the last thing I'll mention is the the satisfaction surveys. So many of us feedback that when we're taking a look at how we measure our success that we use a tool of satisfaction surveys. And so I'll bring you back to the concept of when I was talking about the language of power and the power of language, is that a satisfaction survey that's sent to a family that sees us in a position of power, it's a very that becomes maybe something that they have not necessarily engaged in. And have we found ways or explored ways to assess satisfaction using methods that employ the concept of cultural brokering and community liaisons? Have we found cultural brokers, individuals that can help us bridge into certain cultural groups? And have we identified within our staff or within cultural groups that community liaison that can teach us how to assess our services and how to maybe adapt our services to be culturally responsive and flexible? So I apologize for squeezing it in at the end, but I can't tell you how much I appreciate having 250 of our closest friends hang on for 4 more minutes after 3:30 to talk about the concept of cultural considerations. And we did give you a practice scenario if you want to take that back to your workplace. It's a very simple one, but we found that it leads to lots and lots of discussions. You guys, happy holidays for wherever you're celebrating, whatever you're celebrating, and Happy New Year to every one of you, and we look forward to seeing you on future webinars.
Thank you, Wendy. And just a reminder to all participants that there is a link that was put in the chat box. It's also, I don't think it's on this slide, but I can go back to the other slide where it is, for you to complete the evaluation. And if you came on late, after you complete the evaluation, you will want to email Jessica Fuentes-Diaz to request your verification of completion for the CRC for this webinar. So right here on this slide, if you click on where it says webinar evaluation at the bottom, it is a hyperlink that will take you directly to the evaluation. And we are very thankful to have had all of you with us today and hope that you will continue to engage in this conversation with your colleagues. And please feel free to reach out to Wendy or I if there's other information you'd like to get. And don't forget, you can download all the materials from the screen at the top where it says download materials. So thank you, everybody. And Jessica, if you have any final comments. If not, have a great day.